Hey guys, and welcome back to Darkhorse Paranormal. This is our last episode of Vampires of the UK. In this episode, we'll be covering the mystery of the Highgate vampire. We would like to point out that this account by us has been put together for entertainment purposes only, as some parts have been altered. However, at the end or during this podcast, you may find a little bit of information from Mr. Sean Manchester himself about the goings on within the Highgate cemetery. Within what we have found out while researching into this story, you will find out about two main people that have high connections with Highgate cemetery, and also see some videos from their time at the Highgate cemetery. These two important players are in fact David Farrant and Mr. Sean Manchester. So let's take you to the beginning with Mr. David Farrant. Mr. David Farrant was a self-described investigator and psychic. David Farrant always stated his psychic gift to be of a white witch. David Farrant in 1967 became the founder of the British Psychic and Cult Society. However, it was in 1969 David Farrant reports a massive increase of vandalism, such as family vaults being opened, coffins being smashed apart, with even skeleton remains of loved ones that were supposed to be at rest were scattered around the paths. Some described as sleeping people, but having all the moisture removed. In some bizarre circumstances, it was reported that the bodies were stolen altogether. Mr. David Farrant claimed also in 1969 there were two reports made to the British Psychic Occult Society, from here we'll call the BPOS. The first came from a gentleman who worked as a respectful accountant and who wished to remain unknown. This accountant claimed to have had a mysterious first-hand encounter with whatever was lurking in the grounds of Highgate Cemetery. Over the next few pages, we have listed a statement of the encounter for you all to see.
Dear Mr. David Farrant, I would like to give you my report of my experience within Highgate Cemetery. I found myself recently within the grounds of Highgate Cemetery was when I noticed the light beaming to fade. I made the decision to leave the grounds of the cemetery. However, maybe it was the light dimming. I found myself lost and helpless. I am not a superstitious person or believe in the existence of these so-called ghosts, but when I encountered while walking calmly around the cemetery looking for the next exit gate give me the shivers to this day. I somehow, even though I was alone, become aware of a presence behind me. Become aware of a presence behind me. I suddenly swung around, and at a distance of 6 feet in front of me was what seemed a strange figure hovering above the ground. I found myself completely in a staring gaze at this hovering shadow or phantom, and so frozen I was unable to move. I started to feel strange, drained of energy, like if you were diabetic and you need your insulin. This come across myself in seconds, like it was a force that within seconds retained me in unconscious to time or my surroundings. So strong was this drain of energy, it felt as if I was in the trance for several minutes, until the hovering phantom vanished abruptly. It was only then, when the phantom vanished, I was able to slowly begin to regain my normal self.
Mr. David Farrand commented about the accountant, which is as follows, and was in good standing regarding the accountant.
He seemed to me to be of a good mind sense and a logical person, but not the type of person to fantasize or exaggerate.
The second account that contained a lot less detail, and due to the witness nature, could have been less credible, but David Farrand took this also serious. Armed with these reports, David Farrand was considerably excited, and it was then in December 1969 an overnight vigil was to be held on the grounds of Highgate Cemetery. However, by the reports of the December vigil, it seemed like David Farrand at one point kinda shit himself and left the grounds of Highgate Cemetery to later return that night with full intentions to spend the whole winter night within the creepy, mysterious walls of Highgate Cemetery. Soon after this vigil and encounters, an emergency meeting was called with the BPOS. Within this meeting, Mr. David Farrand, the accountant, and the witness statements were discussed. It was also agreed within the meeting that the eyewitness's statement from the anonymous accountant and the elder lady were and all could very much be authentic. With the result of these two witnesses being legitimate and backed by Mr. David Farrand's vigil, it was then agreed night vigils were to be conducted. This consisted of two members to be located at both stations where the eyewitnesses' statements have encountered this mysterious figure. It was also agreed that video and audio recording equipment of its time would and could be used. However, it was also agreed that none of the group should use any psychic means, such as ways of sciences in which to encourage the unknown identity to materialize. This was important because at this point the BPOS ruled and treated the entity as a malevolent, and its capabilities and intentions were still unknown and still not rightly understood. The BPOS thought it would be an excellent idea to interview more first-hand witnesses. Mr. David Farrand then wrote a letter to the Hampstead and Highgate Express to ask their readers to write in and share experiences. The letter was published on the 6th of February 1970 under the heading Ghostly Walks in Highgate. The article, Ghostly Walks in Highgate. Some nights I walk home past the gates of Highgate Cemetery. On 3 occasions I have seen what appeared to be a ghostly-like figure inside the gates at the top of Swan's Lane. The first occasion was on Christmas Eve, a sort of grey figure for a few seconds before it disappeared into the darkness. The second sighting a week later was also brief. Last week the figure appeared only a few yards inside the gates. This time it was there long enough for me to see, and much more clearly. And now I can think of no other explanation than this apparition being supernatural. I have no knowledge in this field, and I would be interested to hear if any other readers have seen anything of this nature. David Farrand, 9 Presswood Mansions, N6. 1 week later, the 13th of February issue, the newspaper published 4 readers' comments on the mysterious spectre on Swan's Lane. On the 20th of February issue, a plea for more information was published, along with 5 more responses. Ghostly cyclists, shadow men in top hats, walking through walls, the Wild Eggman, and Mad Arthur were also seen by locals. During this current time, the BPOS investigation info, what is stalking the grounds of Highgate Cemetery, was well underway, and this investigation made some shocking discoveries. One of the shocking discoveries is that the BPOS investigators proved that beyond any doubt that satanic mass was definitely being held on the grounds of Highgate Cemetery. It was also clear to the BPOS that it was not the youths that were carrying out these satanic rituals. Youths were quizzed out of it, and that was due to the very high level of satanic and black magic that was being used during the rituals. These particular rituals were taking place in a maze of catacombs that ran deep beneath the Highgate Cemetery. However, it's noted that the BPOS investigations didn't just uncover evidence of satanic worship. It was only within the first few weeks of the nighttime visuals carried out by the BPOS there became 2 more sightings of this creature. The first sighting of the creature backed up by the accountant's statement, as the creature was seen near to some spot of the accountant's encounters. This time the creature was seen swinging around but vanished promptly soon after. The second sighting was brief through the cemetery gates. Neither sightings were reported to last more than a few seconds. During the time at night investigations were being carried out, the BPOS and the general public were noticing something else that began to happen within the grounds of Highgate Cemetery. What else it uncovered was a number of animal carcasses were being found within the cemetery. These were believed and then proved to be from a fox. The causes of death for these creatures seemed to be unclear, and due to the forces being considered a pest at this time, that meant no effort or cost was included to obtain professional examination. However, within a small number of cases, there were obvious wounds or puncture marks to the fox's neck. The fox death became heavily talked about by the general public and became a link to Highgate Cemetery, and due to this the local newspapers released an article on the 6th of March with a headline reading, "Why do the foxes die?" Due to the media awareness, the local people around Highgate Cemetery made small talk and started speculation that a vampire was feeding on the foxes, but other locals speculated and that they were tied to black magic rituals and the need for animal blood as a sacrifice. However, all this exposure by the media came not just possible sightings, but it also attracted unwanted attention. For example, David Farrant claimed that due to the increased exposure, whoever was performing these rituals within and beneath Highgate Cemetery was sending the BPOS threatening letters with the post, and 3 letters were also signed in blood and covered with satanic symbols. These letters claimed that the BPOS was interfering with the work of their order and had invoked the weight of a satanic lord. This satanic lord was going under the name Hadit. Well, I'm hoping you're enjoying this up to now, as we here at Darkhorse Paranormal are bringing you the legendary story of the Highgate vampire. However, it's time for us to look back in time slightly. This is because during this time, without David Farrant or the BPOS knowing anything, there was another investigation that was taking place, and also well underway. There was a gentleman called Shaw Manchester, and he was also making his own visits to Highgate Cemetery. Mr. Manchester's interest was completely independent and separate to the BPOS and Mr. David Farrant's investigations that we have covered so far. Shaw Manchester was an interesting guy. He, like Mr. David Farrant, also was connected to a few organisations himself. These organisations are as follows: the British Occult Society and the Vampire Research Society. Mr. Shaw Manchester's investigation also found evidence of increased fox deaths around the local area, and also had evidence of slices around the throat and being completely drained of blood. Mr. Shaw Manchester had also been hearing accounts near Highgate Cemetery for a long time before the media frenzy. Mr. Manchester also had embarked on his own investigations and had also spoken to eyewitnesses that were different to Mr. David Farrant. Shaw Manchester had been cooperating with his own circle of like-minded friends who had interest in the occult. One person who Shaw Manchester was coordinating with was a well-known and respectful paranormal investigator, Mr. Peter Underwood. Peter Underwood also wrote a number of well-known books under the topic of paranormal investigations. Mr. Peter Underwood was a consultant of a number of groups, and thanks to his national and his logical approach, his research was trusted by a number of media organisations. Mr. Peter Underwood was the president of the Ghost Society from 1960 to 1993. Unfortunately, Peter Underwood sadly passed away in 2014, and his guardian, obituary, they described him and his approach to his work as follows. Within this, we've left 3 minutes for each page for us to read, with no commentary, just out of respect, to show respect for us to Mr. Peter. Mr. Peter Underwood collected a number of reports over the years in respect to the Highgate vampire. In one of Mr. Underwood's books, The Vampire's Bedside Companion, this includes his own notes and a summation of events and a full account written by Mr. Sean Manchester himself. Within this book, Mr. Underwood offers an endorsement to Mr. Sean Manchester's account. It was this endorsement that made Mr. Sean Manchester's account and research the most relevant and most worthy. Within Mr. Sean Manchester's account, and even with Mr. Sean Manchester being a part of the search of finding out about this creature at Highgate Cemetery was indeed true or false, Mr. Sean Manchester thought there were more people more qualified and experienced for the job, with Mr. Peter Underwood being one of them. Anyway, Mr. Sean Manchester and his circle of people had now heard the locals talk about the strange things in and around Highgate Cemetery. The talk that Mr. Sean Manchester was currently hearing from the locals was the same of what we have mentioned previously with Mr. David Farrant's account. Sean Manchester had previously met with a number of people who had come forward to talk to him about their own stories and what they had experienced. 2 accounts were as early as 1967. The first statement Mr. Sean Manchester received involved 2 local 16-year-olds, schoolgirls, who attended a local convent school, which, checking the area at the time, could well have been La Sainte Union Catholic School. Anyway, back to the story. These accounts get very interesting from here. These 2 16-year-old schoolgirls were called Elizabeth and Barbara. These girls were both intelligent and bright students. They were out after school at a friend's house. It was getting dark, so these 2 girls started to walk home. The route home took them down Swains Lane in Highgate. During their walk down Swains Lane, they passed the north gate of the Highgate Cemetery. Elizabeth and Barbara couldn't believe what they saw before them. Elizabeth and Barbara recall at the north gate of the cemetery that they were witness to a sight of a mixture between something that looked like an urban jungle, with unkept weeds, bushes, grass, trees, amongst a number of graves that were practically in disarray. Elizabeth and Barbara, in total silence and under the darkness of the sky, Elizabeth and Barbara both reported to pick up their pace, and only once they reached the end of Swains Lane did they have the verge to use their voices. However, this was only to confirm to each other that the pair had both indeed witnessed the same thing. Some months after this incident, Elizabeth reached out to Mr. Sean Manchester and offered the following account.
Normally going past the cemetery when you're just in a normal mood, you can feel the evil presence from the old cemetery. But this time, my friend and I were coming down from Highgate village, and we were both in a high spirit. We had just been to see a girlfriend, and we were happy. We were not talking, just walking. It was when we were walking down, having just passed the north gate, when we both saw the scene of graves directly in front of us. These graves were opening up in front of our eyes, and people were rising from the tombs. We were not concerned of walking down a lane. We were only concerned of the grave scenes.
In each of Elizabeth's dreams, this evil entity was always seeking entry through a bedroom window, a little like Father Christmas. Elizabeth noted when talking about her dreams that the evil entity face was white, just like the face of the bodies she encountered at the Highgate Cemetery gates in Swains Lane. Despite Elizabeth having a hard time with these dreadful nightmares, Elizabeth reported that she felt slightly silly, as when she wakes up the following morning, she finds the window in fact closed, and no harm had ever happened to her. The second account that caught Mr. Sean Manchester's attention was this time involving a young couple who were walking home after a nearby pub in Highgate. They were both walking home happily, holding hands, laughing, giggling away to each other in a merry state. They took their usual route down Swain's Lane, past the same gate Elizabeth and Barbara had their paranormal encounter at. It was at this gate, suddenly, out of nowhere, the girlfriend froze to the spot and began to scream at the top of her voice. It's noted right before them both was someone standing just a few feet away on the other side of the gate, and on his face was an absolute look of sheer terror. The couple watched petrified, and then just like that the person disappeared into the night. This account came to Mr. Sean Manchester quite strangely, as it wasn't the man that reached out to Mr. Manchester. It was a mutual friend they both had in common that told Mr. Sean Manchester of the encounter. After hearing the account from his friend, Mr. Sean Manchester reached out with the gentleman after hearing the account. Fuck off. After hearing the account through a friend, Mr. Sean Manchester reached out to the gentleman and asked him to take him to the spot where this creature had appeared and then disappeared. The day came, Mr. Sean Manchester met up with the gentleman and they went to the spot. However, they found out that the gates were locked at this time. After inquiring about it, it was brought to Mr. Sean Manchester and the gentleman's attention that this section of the Highgate Cemetery was closed to the public, even during the daylight hours. But that never stopped them. After finding out that information, Mr. Manchester arranged to meet the gentleman again, but this time at night. Even at this time, Elizabeth and Barbara's paranormal encounter had already taken place at this point in the investigation of the Highgate Cemetery by both Mr. Sean Manchester and David Farrant. However, no one had heard Elizabeth's experience yet. So that being said, this was the first incident that was investigated by Mr. Sean Manchester, and it was after this meeting with the gentleman and seeing the site for himself that he resolved to examine Highgate Cemetery in more detail and also began to research the local area. Mr. Manchester correctly done his research, and it was carried out perfectly, and it showed that 700 years prior, a castle had once dominated the place where Highgate Cemetery lays. It was also discovered that a large site of what is now to this day known as Highgate Village was once a countryside, and this was enclosed and used exclusively for hunting of deer. By the 16th century, the castle was reduced to a heap of rubble, and the land had become very overgrown. It was also during his research that Mr. Sean Manchester found out that Highgate Cemetery was opened in 1839, just 6 years after Highgate became its own district. He also found out that due to the rapid growth of London cemetery space was much needed, and Highgate Cemetery soon became one of the most beautiful places of rest within London. It's also noted that by 1889, Highgate Cemetery had already become home to more than 100,000 bodies. Mr. Manchester also visited the cemetery during the day, only entering through the main gate, which was the only gate in use to the general public at the time. The night came when Mr. Sean Manchester was going to meet the gentleman at Highgate Cemetery. However, after an anxious wait, the gentleman didn't turn up to meet Mr. Manchester as planned. However, he shitted himself and sent his girlfriend, who turned up on his behalf. The girlfriend wasn't there to give her account of what happened that night. Instead, she revealed and grasped her boyfriend out to Mr. Sean Manchester that something had happened a few nights earlier. Unknown to them both, this helped Mr. Manchester so much in his investigation, more than they both knew. as the information relayed to Mr. Sean Manchester by the girlfriend was that the gentleman, under no circumstances, could ever be persuaded to return to Highgate Cemetery. You see, the girlfriend revealed that this gentleman had took it upon himself to engage in an evening of ghost hunting. Now Mr. Sean Manchester managed to meet the gentleman the following evening. It was this following day that the gentleman confided the following account to Mr. Sean Manchester. My friend and I arrived in Swains Lane shortly before midnight. We scaled the wall with some difficulty. We were close to the north gate. We were armed with just our flashlights, and we followed the path into the cemetery for about 100 yards. To tell you the truth, I was more intrigued with what I thought was a ghost, and with the whole idea of searching it out seemed quite an adventure. In fact, in the back of my mind, I don't think I really believed in such things, and dark places, graveyards, etc. have never bothered me. Anyway, after a while of taking to the ground and these gravestones, both my friend and myself thought we heard a low vibrating noise. It was what seemed like booming noise. It seemed to grow louder and louder. I say we thought because it seemed to prevail on the other senses too. I mean, we could feel it. Suddenly a dark shape moved across the path of us, directly in front of both of us. The thing was, the only time we actually saw anything. No sooner was it there, it was gone. If you ask me to describe the sickening feeling of fear that surrounded us, then I can't. Not even getting shot in the buttocks comes close to it. However, that night air became heavy, and I mean very heavy, and our legs felt weak and trembled a great deal. And that time, this was for no reason. All of a sudden I recited the Lord's Prayer aloud. Shortly after, we regained our strength and we ran for the wall, and this is where we escaped. However, Mr. Manchester did not devote too much of his time with the Highgate Cemetery. This was due to the gentleman's no-shows and the other pressing matters. Mr. Manchester then put Highgate Cemetery on hold. It's now 1969, 2 years after taking Elizabeth's account at Highgate Cemetery. Mr. Sean Manchester receives a chance encounter. Mr. Manchester takes this chance and arranges to meet for a coffee. This chance encounter was in fact Elizabeth. It was noted that Elizabeth's voice was barely audible. Elizabeth did, however, manage to tell Mr. Sean Manchester that she moved from a room where her parents lived to a house where she now lived alone in the Highgate area. It was at this coffee meeting that Elizabeth confided in Mr. Sean Manchester with a number of things, mostly about nightmares she was currently going through. These nightmares have seemed to return, but they are now more disturbing than they had ever been before. Elizabeth gave Mr. Sean Manchester a full account of one nightmare she was having. This is the account of that nightmare.
Midnight has struck and I was slowly falling asleep. It is at this point I experienced not a dream but something a lot higher than that. I am aware of the stillness of the night and something started to approach. Although I sensed danger, I could not wake because I feel awake. All the time there is a feeling of something drawn closer and closer. It is at this time I noticed I feel both hot and cold, and I'm saturated with a quirky heartbeat. I begin to feel something is outside my window, and I am filled with a mixture of fascination and terror. I am drowsy. I am too weak to even lift my head. My legs and arms feel as if weights have been attached to them. I can't move. Suddenly I become aware that whatever is approaching is now at the bottom of my bed. Then its form grows larger and larger. At first, I see the face of a wild animal with glaring eyes and sharp teeth. But in fact, it's a man with the expression of an animal. The face is gaunt and grey. I feel dizzy and growing faint. Something has just touched me. It feels icy and cold. There becomes a strange falling sensation that I remember no more.
Even with this account that was given to Mr. Sean Manchester from Elizabeth, he still felt, despite the conversation, there was still a void between them. Mr. Sean Manchester compared Elizabeth to someone who was sleepwalking, and this was due to the constant pauses in between them talking. The pauses would last several minutes, and out of nowhere Elizabeth would come back to life again, but in the process look up, smile like nothing has ever happened. Mr. Shaw Manchester had to be really patient with Elizabeth, but this allowed them to establish that Elizabeth was getting headaches, dizziness and occasional nausea. The next day Mr. Shaw Manchester had a full-out meeting with Elizabeth at the flat. Mr. Shaw Manchester arrived like planned to Elizabeth's flat. He was kindly introduced to her boyfriend, a nice tall Scottish chap called Keith. Although both Keith and Mr. Shaw Manchester didn't know it just yet, Keith was set to be a very valuable player in the coming weeks and months. While Elizabeth made the drinks, Keith caught up with Mr. Shaw Manchester about Elizabeth's background. Mr. Shaw Manchester learned from Keith that day that Elizabeth had a Polish descent with a strict Catholic upbringing, and her father was a strict man who had a very strong set of rules. Keith went on to explain that Elizabeth's father was not keen on Keith and Elizabeth being in a relationship. It was down to Elizabeth's decision, not being able to tolerate living under her father's rule, so she set out and took on her own independence. It was at this point during the conversation that Elizabeth came back into the room after making the drinks for them all. It was then she spoke about a strange thing that happened right after she moved into the flat. Elizabeth had been sitting one time in front of a mirror while brushing her hair, and she became aware of a loud humming noise all around her. She stated to Mr. Manchester that at this time she became very frightened, but she did not know why. The humming noise started to become louder and louder, and Elizabeth became aware of a presence nearby. There was someone or something standing by her feet. She was too terrified to turn around or look in the mirror. She did, however, try her best to clear her mind, including closing her eyes and saying brief prayers. Elizabeth says it was at this point in the humming noise around her vanished, and a sense of terror disappeared. Other stories were accounted for during this meeting, some of similar feeling, others were incidents and sensations. Most of these encounters were around the time Elizabeth would be in bed. It was noted by Mr. Manchester that Elizabeth says she would take herself off to bed, only to have a strange urge to get up and go out. However, Elizabeth could not tell Mr. Manchester or her partner Keith of where she felt the urge to go that late at night. Mr. Shaw Manchester made notes about Elizabeth, and one note there seemed to be a lot going on with Elizabeth. Shaw Manchester, Keith and Elizabeth spent a good amount of time going through the accounts of these strange going-ons. Mr. Manchester had a lot of information now, and he decided it was time to leave to go through all the work and find out what was going on. Mr. Manchester finally managed to get up off the chair and was set to leave, and Keith then raised about Elizabeth waking up with marks on her neck, some scratches, but Elizabeth dismissed this and told Keith to stop being silly. Elizabeth didn't want to talk about these strange marks Keith had just mentioned. So many weeks passed, and then Mr. Sean Manchester received a phone call from a strange number. He answered the call. It was in fact Keith. Keith was shocked and apologising to Mr. Manchester about disturbing him, and didn't mean to bother him. Mr. Manchester noted that Keith was anxious to Elizabeth's state of mind and her health. Keith was inquiring to see Mr. Manchester could make a visit, which he did. He visited them both that evening. It's worth noting that Elizabeth's condition has definitely undergone a vast change for the worse. Elizabeth was no longer eating much, if not any at times. Due to this, Elizabeth had found herself so weak she was now struggling to walk. From looking at Elizabeth, her skin was loose and as pale as a marble tablet. However, Elizabeth and Keith had shown Mr. Manchester that they had both applied and got help from a local doctor. The doctor offered them a prescription of vitamins and iron tablets. It was during this emergency meeting that Keith was having a chat with Mr. Manchester, and things were about to take a different outlook. Keith claimed to Mr. Manchester that he believed that the help Elizabeth needed was not the kind of help you would receive from your local doctor. Very passionately, Keith went on to explain to Mr. Manchester that he thinks it was most likely that Elizabeth had been taken over by someone or something. Mr. Sean Manchester went on to question this young Scotsman and what he could have meant by this. And during this time of inquiry, Mr. Manchester asked Keith if he believed in such things as possession or demonic molestations. The line of inquiry must have felt strange and silly once Keith had spoken about it out loud, as Keith just simply shook his shoulders in almost disbelief that this young lady with his affections could have been affected by an evil entity in front of his own eyes. It's worth pointing out that Mr. Sean Manchester hadn't or even wished to describe a paranormal explanation for Elizabeth's issues, and that she was experiencing. Mr. Manchester actually wanted to rule out other lines of illness first. However, that being said, Mr. Sean Manchester did confirm to Keith, off record at the time, that he too was concerned that it seemed to him that a supernatural force was influencing Elizabeth. Let me just stop it here for a minute and jump back in time when we're talking about Mr. Peter Underwood and the vampire's bedside companions. When he validated Mr. Sean Manchester about his work, I'll include that now at this point. Ever since I became aware of the Highgate Cemetery was the erupted hunt of a vampire, the incantation and activities of Mr. Sean Manchester commanded my attention. I became convinced that more than anyone else, this psychic consultant and president of the British Occult Society knew the full story of the Highgate vampire, and I am delighted to be able to include his remarkable contribution as a separate chapter in my book for the vampire's bedside companion. This account of Mr. Manchester provides a startling account of present-day vampirism by a researcher into the field of occultism, who, like all true researchers, looks for a rational explanation. Sometimes, however, no such explanation is forthcoming. While all this was going on with Keith and Mr. Manchester within the flat, it was noted how Elizabeth never really spoke. She just sat there quiet in the chair, while Keith and Mr. Manchester were discussing what was happening within the past few weeks. During the conversation, Mr. Sean Manchester approached Elizabeth to check on her, and by doing so, sat in the chair next to her. It was at this point Mr. Manchester could now see what Keith was talking about at the last meeting, about these strange marks on Elizabeth's neck. However, at one point Elizabeth realised what was going on, and Mr. Manchester could see the wounds. With the little energy Elizabeth had, she used a cover to cover the visible marks of the wounds around her neck. Mr. Manchester noted what he got to see, and then he re-engaged with Keith and stated it was too early to determine if Elizabeth was definitely subjected to a demon takeover or not. Sean Manchester did, however, make his feelings strong and told Keith that under no circumstances Elizabeth could be left alone in the evenings. Keith agreed with Mr. Manchester on it, and it was Keith who suggested that he will stay with Elizabeth at night and help her through this situation. Mr. Manchester knew this situation with Keith and Elizabeth was something strange, and with Keith's suggestion, he promised to give the matter his full attention while he went to research as much as possible. It wasn't until a few weeks later Keith attempted to speak to Elizabeth about the strange going on and her behaviour during this curvaceon. Keith gently spoke to Elizabeth in a calm manner, suggesting that the actual force or presence might be around her. Elizabeth, again, just like the marks on her neck, Keith pointed out to Mr. Manchester, refused to engage within this conversation. Keith then said in a more firm voice to Elizabeth that he felt her conscious mind seems unaware or refuses to become aware that some other strange force was in control of her actions. Keith spoke to Mr. Manchester one morning. He talked about observing her in a fight between two forces, which was visible with her gestures and actions. On hearing that Keith and Elizabeth interaction, Mr. Manchester came back to Elizabeth's flat. This time was greeted by Keith. Elizabeth was asleep and refused food again. On this flat visit, though, Mr. Sean Manchester witnessed bloody pillows and inquired of Keith how he felt blood may have got there. Keith then speculated to Mr. Manchester that without any certainty that Elizabeth had coughed up the blood during the night in her sleep. Mr. Sean Manchester had a changed thought at this point. Maybe it was down to seeing the blood on the pillow and Keith's explanation. For the first time in this case, Mr. Manchester divulged that his chief subject that lay behind the supernatural assaults and how it actually seemed to be taking control of Elizabeth was that of a vampire. This news came to Keith as a complete shock. Keith, naturally, as you and I will not believe it regarding a vampire possession. Keith went as far as explaining to Mr. Manchester that even if this was the case for Elizabeth's behaviour, no one will ever believe the idea of it, or even be able to take it seriously. At this time of the discussions between Keith and Mr. Sean Manchester, it would be right to note at this point that Mr. Manchester was well into his research within the Highgate cemetery. Some of the research Mr. Sean Manchester at this point was able to share with Keith at the time had some texts which supported Mr. Manchester's claims and thoughts surrounding Elizabeth. Although it was made clear and very apparently Keith had initially reluctant to accept some thought of paranormal conclusion, even when handed the evidence that backed Mr. Sean Manchester's claims, Keith reluctantly accepted, and something he could not explain was at war with Elizabeth. To give you an idea on the situation at the time when Mr. Manchester mentioned the word vampire to Keith, it instantly triggered the sense of disbelief. Even when Mr. Shaw Manchester went through all the symptoms Elizabeth was experiencing, and the accounts of her behaviour backed by an endemic condition, the marks on her neck, the deep trance-like episodes, and her being drawn to the grounds of Highgate Cemetery. This conclusion was seemingly the most fitted conclusion. It was later on that Mr. Manchester then approached Keith and inquired about what Elizabeth's life was like when she lived with him family, mostly concerning whether the house contained Christian symbols, such as crucifix, a Bible. Keith confirmed that the house Elizabeth did used to live in with her family was covered in every room with crucifix and vessels of holy waters, and yet there was nothing within the flat of Elizabeth. It was with this, of learning about the history Shaw Manchester recalled and pictured together, that all the facts pointed to Elizabeth being under a paranormal attack since her original sighting within Swan's Lane when she was 16. But it seemed like her parents' house had provided the suitable barriers of protection against this dark entity. Mr. Shaw Manchester was putting an end to this conversation by concluding that traditional vampire repellents were now needed to fight back and ward off this entity. They started to get a bit serious now, and it was Keith was warning the idea. He mentioned to Mr. Shaw Manchester that Elizabeth used to wear a gold crucifix at all times, but in the recent past months she had taken it off and never wore it anymore. It was at this point too that Keith also agreed to do whatever was necessary to fight this unseen force that was attacking and playing with Elizabeth. In preparation to give Elizabeth the best chance of fighting this dark entity, believed to be of a vampire, Keith and Mr. Shaw Manchester sealed Elizabeth's doorway with salt, and a piece of linen was hung from the door, which held a silver cross. Keith also took it upon himself to write out the first 14 verses of the Gospel of St. John and place it beneath her pillow. Elizabeth's neck wounds were treated with holy water, and the flat was also doused with holy water, with vessels left around the rooms. The dousing of holy water within the flat was done while the creed was recited in a loud voice. I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was convicted by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, and crucified, died, and was buried. He descended into hell on the third day and rose again from the dead. He ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of God the Father Almighty. From there he will come and judge the living and the dead. I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Holy Catholic Church, the communication of saints, the forgiveness of sins, the restoration of the body, and life everlasting. It was Mr. Manchester who took might upon himself to be the person responsible to furnish Elizabeth's room. This room now has a large crucifix that's hanging. Mr. Shaw Manchester also warned Keith that Elizabeth would be more vulnerable at night, and if Elizabeth was to show signs of distress, there could be a sign that a vampire was nearby, and the vampire may be attempting to control Elizabeth. And if Keith seen any such sign present itself, he should assume that the creature would wish to influence Elizabeth, to try and get her to remove any protective items that they have put in place. Under no circumstances was this allowed at any time. Mr. Shaw Manchester was adamant to Keith if an attempt to take control was underway, Keith's role was to step in and try and counter the force. by reciting the following prayer. Let us therefore pray to Almighty God that he will avert from this province, and especially from his home, every ill, and that he may be pleased to shield us from the unmiserable crafts of Satan, from the snares of the devil, and from the patience of God. Lord, deliver us. It was only just after one night, Keith reported, and wrote a letter of information to Mr. Sean Manchester about what happened within Elizabeth's flat. Last night I did as you asked me. I sat in the armchair within Elizabeth's bedroom while she slept. I watched as Elizabeth withered between the sheets, as if she had a bad fever. Elizabeth starts to emit strangely groans and gasps for air. Her forehead was burning, and Elizabeth a few times would search her neck for the cross you gave me to put there. I honestly thought Elizabeth was going to snap and throw the chain and cross on several occasions. I gently held her arms, preventing this from happening, and returned her arms to the side and comforted her. I do, though, however, have to apologise, as I did eventually nod off to sleep in the armchair. I couldn't tell you how long for, but I was wakened by a crash. When I woke, I noticed the vase of flowers had been knocked over by the curtains, and a howling wind blew through the now open window. Elizabeth was sitting up right in her bed, looking over at the open window. The cross was no longer around her neck. I sprang to my feet and made the sign of the cross, uttering the prayer that you gave me. Uttering the prayer, I closed the window and went to Elizabeth, who seemed unaware of everything that was happening around her. The cross, still on its broken chain, was on the floor by the bed. I replaced it and put it back on Elizabeth and resumed my guard. There were no further incidents that night. It's a good job that Mr. Sean Manchester was a man of his word. He did make Elizabeth and Keith his main priority. He made a number of routine and regular visits, and it seemed for the next few weeks or so that Elizabeth was restless and would request the removal of measures of protection from her and from around the flat, to both Mr. Sean Manchester and Keith. At times, Keith would discover that things had been moved from around the flat. These were replaced or repositioned by Keith to maintain the barrier of protection, as instructed by Mr. Manchester, and Keith ensured that everything was put back to its proper order before dusk. As stated, the first week was hard for both Elizabeth and Keith, even with the backing and advice of Mr. Manchester himself. But after this week had passed, it seemed like it was getting a little bit easier for Elizabeth. Keith reported that Elizabeth started to sleep at night, and over the more coming weeks, there was vast improvement. It seemed like her demon had seemed to have vanished, and the constant use of holy water to Elizabeth's neck, the wounds went away, and her neck began to heal. This were many more accounts, and many more incidents taking place around Highgate Cemetery. Mr. Sean Manchester mentions a man that was walking down Swains Lane and saw something standing there on the other side of the gate, with a mortified expression on his face. It seemed to be there for a short amount of time, and then would vanish into the dark air. There was also another account by a female teenager called Jacqueline. This incident was also reported. This came about after her brother became interested in the ghostly goings-on at Highgate Cemetery, and the pair had made some visits. In this account of Jacqueline's, she would wake one night at home, suddenly as if something had rudely awakened her during her deep sleep. This one night was like something as cold as ice grabbed her by the hand. In half-awake state, Jacqueline recalls moving her arm away quick to break free. Jacqueline reported being numb after breaking away from the contact, but Jacqueline did in fact go back to sleep. After this incident, it went till the following morning. When Jacqueline woke up properly, she found her arm wounded and scratched, as if it had been ripped free of something or someone's claws. There became another strange encounter of a 22-year-old woman who wrote a letter to Mr. Manchester to give him her concern regarding his sister's behaviours, which included sleepwalking and suffocation during the night. One night his sister Lucia, while asleep, walking left the house and later found in Swains Lane near the grounds of Highgate Cemetery. This account that came to Mr. Manchester stood out a fair bit to him. The account was very similar to the account of Elizabeth's, so much Mr. Manchester made immediate contact. However, the phone line was unresponsive. Mr. Manchester had no option apart from leaving his personal number, and a number of instructions to follow if Lucia tried to leave the apartment once more. The next two occasions of this account of Lucia happened late at night, and Julie, Lucia's sister, reached out to Mr. Manchester. Mr. Sean Manchester made his way straight to Lucia's apartment to find Lucia staring with a blank expression on her face, looking out of a bedroom window. These trances Lucia was experiencing seemed to last no longer than half an hour before returning back to bed, completely unaware of Mr. Manchester and Julia's presence within the bedroom. A third call came to Mr. Manchester. However, this call had to be relayed by an intermediate to Mr. Manchester. This was due to Mr. Manchester currently being held up on another paranormal investigation. When Mr. Manchester eventually received the message after the slight delay in relaying the message, he raced over to the apartment to see Lucia. However, Lucia weren't there. Instead, Mr. Manchester found a strange note pinned to the apartment door. The note read the following.
Lucia has been standing in a trance, looking out the window for around the past 20 minutes. Lucia then headed downstairs of the apartment, unlocked the front door and left the apartment. I will not attempt to wake Lucia, but I have followed her from Julia.
Mr. Manchester snatched the note and put it in his coat pocket and raced down to Swains Lane. Mr. Manchester did this only due to Elizabeth's account, with her being drawn to Highgate Cemetery. However, there was no sign of either Lucia or Julia. Mr. Manchester was then starting to panic and worry. He knew he had to catch this, whatever it was, causing the general public to be drawn to the cemetery. Out of sheer panic, Mr. Manchester ran down Swains Lane, past the north gate of the Highgate Cemetery, into Pond Square, and he chose to bear left into Hampstead Heath, and it wasn't long before he caught a glimpse of Julia and Lucia. Lucia and Julia had entered the forecourt to St. Michael's churchyard. Lucia looked like she was still in a deep trance. This was noticed by the way Julia and Lucia were walking slowly together, much like Lucia was showing Julia the way to go. They both walked down the left side of St. Michael's Church, and after a fair few minutes of slow walking, they eventually went through a gap in some railings and entered Highgate Cemetery. We will skip back a few seconds and note that Lucia passed through a gap in the gates. Julia grabbed Mr. Sean Manchester by the arm and asked if it was possible that they don't proceed any further and return Lucia back to her apartment. However, Mr. Sean Manchester knew that this was extremely important to follow through with this while Lucia was safe and under his watchful eye, as he may be able to learn the location of whatever was drawing Lucia, and maybe Elizabeth too, out on late night walks. Lucia somehow managed to negotiate her way through the rough and stony terrain like to full capacity despite not being conscious. Even though the night could be classed as pitch black, Lucia was wearing a white nightgown, which was able to be seen under the faint moonlight. Mr. Sean Manchester and Julia watched from a short distance as Lucia walked down towards the catacombs. All of a sudden, Lucia stopped. Mr. Manchester come across surprised, but had a slight smile on his face as Lucia stopped before a large iron door. Mr. Sean Manchester and Julia watched on as Lucia stood there silently and emotionally before this big ground iron door for several minutes. After these several minutes of standing, Lucia began to move, but not from the spot she was standing on. Instead, she was seen raising her arm towards her neck, grabbing hold of the crucifix on the necklace she was wearing. Lucia snatched it from around her neck and tore it off, and then uncaring and dismissively throwing it to the floor. Suddenly a loud humming noise could be heard, with vibrations being felt as if they were coming from the catacombs. Julia, watching on, instantly became terrified and began to cry hysterically. Mr. Manchester knew he had to do something. Mr. Manchester reached into his pocket, where he always carried his personal silver crucifix. Taken out of his pocket with his hand, he threw it straight to Lucia. The crucifix landed within the space between the iron door and the spot where Lucia was standing. The instant this crucifix hit the floor, the vibrations stopped. As the vibrations stopped, Lucia was also seen gasping for breath and woke up from a long trance. Lucia seemed really confused to how she ended up in the middle of Highgate Cemetery. Mr. Manchester and Julia then began to aid Lucia back to her apartment and tucked her up in bed. The following morning, when Lucia woke from a real peaceful sleep, she was questioned about the previous night, and to Mr. Manchester and Julia's surprise, she had no memory over her little night stroll. Mr. Manchester speculated a number of things within his mind. The following morning, with a smile on his face, he thought on and drawn to him. He may now know the location of the source of what happened to Lucia and previously Elizabeth. However, there was still one question on Mr. Manchester's mind, and now wondered what he lied behind the big iron door. Was this the resting place of the unholy or demonic creature? It was now clear to Mr. Manchester and other researchers like Mr. David Farrant and other local researchers, even the local police, that there was a continuing sense of activity going on around Highgate Cemetery that seemed to involve black magic and dark occult rituals. The evidence of this black magic and dark occult rituals is said to be extensive and undeniable. Mr. Sean Manchester put that aside. His concern was the unholy creature. With all this activity and recent media, Highgate Cemetery was something that was talked about regular in and around Highgate by the general public. Word spread, and a number of people started to express how they wanted to visit Highgate Cemetery. General public, locals, people from far, youths all attended. Highgate Cemetery was influenced by alcohol for the gorge and hoping to see the ghostly creature themselves. Given the attention Highgate Cemetery was getting, and with multiple individuals researching what's going on, it was not long before Mr. Manchester himself was to find himself in the middle of local news. In an article that was printed by local newspapers, does a vampire walk Highgate? Some research came to a theory of King Vampire of the Undead. The theory was a noble woman who was originally from Van Province in Turkey, walked again in modern-day London. Apparently, from during that time in Turkey to walking the secrets again in London. Legend has it that somewhere between Turkey and England, this king vampire changed appearance. As legend goes, his followers brought him to London in a coffin in the 19th century and bought a house for him in the city. His unholy resting place eventually became Highgate Cemetery. In later interviews, when Mr. Manchester was asked over his bit of research, Mr. Sean Manchester goes on to say that the title King Vampire was used under the journalist. However, Mr. Sean Manchester does state the research of the vampire was one of his own. The article goes to claim that the broken graves and bodies no longer in their graves was an attempt of dark satanic magic to react the King Vampire. The newspaper goes on to say that Mr. Sean Manchester and his organisation believe in fighting magic with magic. There was quite a big range in opinions across the general public regarding the article and the publication of the vampire theory. Many readers and locals dismissed it, either one or two things, the first being logical explanation, the second being appeal to a romantic. There was also a big group who took it simply as entertainment due to the similar Hammer horror films that were shown at the time. However, due to the popular conversation spread by the general public and around family members living in different parts of London, made the vampire story break free of local news, and the story hit the national TV news, and it was the national news who turned their attention to all things supernatural in and around Highgate Cemetery. When the vampire claim was put to Mr. David Farrant by journalists, he came to the conclusion, which was of, if this being he has seen turned out to be a vampire, I for sure, for one, am prepared to pursue it, taking whatever means necessary, so we can all rest. More news broke out around this time, and it was around the time of the national news coverage that Mr. Sean Manchester and Mr. David Farrant began a rivalry. They both did not know it yet, but this rivalry was to last the last time. Their pure despite for one another was played very public within the media. It went that big, it eventually reached Thames Television attention, who made contact and content for ITV. It became March 1970, and the news interviewed both Mr. Sean Manchester and David Farrant in a programme that was broadcasted on the 13th of March 1970. Mr. Sean Manchester on that show warned Mr. David Farrant to stay away from the vampire, stating a warning to David Farrant that was as follows. David Farrant goes against our explicit wish for his own safety. We feel David does not possess sufficient knowledge to exercise successfully something as powerful or as evil as this vampire, and he may fall victim as a result. This show went out at 6 p.m. that night. By 8 p.m. that same night, Swains Lane was crowded with people who wanted to catch a look at this mysterious vampire. Many of the people fancied themselves as vampire hunters. By around 10 p.m. that night, a number of people in the crowd were intoxicated, holding sticks as weapons. Some were burning torches. It took an extended police effort to clear Highgate Cemetery and Swans Lane. One member of the public spoke about to describe the crowd in and around Highgate Cemetery. All sorts of tales were told from within the frenzy, but one report came from a traveller from far away. This one reports the following. It was like the end of a Frankenstein film when the monster was chased. People had weapons and looked as if they could have turned nasty if they had seen a tall, lean person lurking in dark clothing. Believe it or not, another witness was a teacher, a school teacher from a primary school in Essex, who had wrote letters to the public and the classmates to give them the day off so they can participate within this vampire hunt. Dear parents, as you know, within Highgate, there has been a member of the news stories around this, and I feel this would be a brilliant opportunity for the entire class to have a field trip on Friday the 13th of March. I class as an education, and I promise no harm will come to your children on this school trip. With your permission, I'll be taking your child along with his classmates to Highgate Cemetery. Despite the massive crowds of people in and around Highgate Cemetery, Mr. Shaw Manchester was able to meet up with a team of around 100 in Swains Lane. Within this group, some members were supposed to contribute the official exorcism group. Within the chaos, they made their way through the Highgate Cemetery to the catacombs, amongst the darkness filled with smoke from the torches from the supposed newly founded, intoxicated vampire hunters. The frigid night, the whirling wails, and the smoky darkness, the group reached the grand iron door that Lucia suddenly stopped at. The group tried with all their strength, however they could not open the awesome iron door of the tomb. Mr. Manchester refused to give in. He knew the walls were damaged from a previous visit. Looking through these gaps, Mr. Manchester saw a gap in the roof, enough to be able to descend one person at a time. However, it was noted that this would be a very dangerous entry point. Mr. Shaw Manchester made a point that himself and two associates will be lowered by rope about 20 feet to the floor. The two associates came forward, and they were lowered one by one through years and years of cobwebs and dust. The group reached the bottom. They began searching the damp interior for signs of confirmation that this was indeed the resting place for the unholy creature. Eventually, it was there, 3 coffins, but no vampire. They all wondered what to do now. So, in case of having a speculation, the group lined the casket with garlic and crucifix, just before sprinkling each with a dash of holy water, and a circle of salt was placed around each of the 3 coffins. The group was satisfied that this was enough, with no bodies laying in these 3 coffins, so they ascended back up the rope line to join the group above. Having just emerged from the tomb on a rope line around 12:45, they were greeted by a bright headlights as the police had made their way inside Highgate Cemetery. Mr. Shaw Manchester was one step ahead. He had already sought permission to be on the ground from the cemetery's administrators to be present at the Highgate Cemetery. However, to control the vast number of crowds and the lane, the police and Mr. Shaw Manchester worked together, sending a number of the associates home. It was now around 2 a.m. on Saturday the 14th of March. There was a dozen hand-picked observers that remained with Mr. Manchester. This group all witnessed a low booming vibrations that felt like was coming from the earth below their feet. The booming grew louder and louder, and suddenly stopped. At a surprise, the tomb was re-inspected, and as expected, the coffins, whereas they had been before, empty. The London Evening News on the 14th of March 1970, under a headline, "Riddle Under Open Tombs." Londoners would read nearly 100 people joined into a vampire hunt at Highgate Cemetery today. Onlookers managed to scale the 10-foot wall and search for an open tomb. Several people scrambled back frightened, claiming they'd seen something crawling within the dark. Anthony Robinson, aged 27, of Austell Road, Hampstead, came out to the cemetery and provided this eyewitness account. I walked past the place and heard a high-pitched noise. Then I saw something grey moving slowly across the road. It terrified me. First time I couldn't make it out, but it looked eerie. I have never believed in anything like this, but now I'm sure there's something evil lurking within Highgate. The effort to suppress the paranormal activity within the area had now officially failed. Despite the growing crowds of 100 plus most nights of the week, the paranormal activity did not decline one bit. What it did do, however, it brought new witnesses in to the papers, and new investigation groups run by Mr. David Farrant continued to bring people into the cemetery to perform their own rituals. Mr. David Farrant would stress publicly that all such rituals he and this group would do would be of white magic and run accordance with white magic practice. As he stated, he was a white witch and would never perform any evil encounters. It was in August 1970, a group of schoolgirls walking in the cemetery came across a headless dead body. This body had been removed from its grave. The position of the body was said to be laying outside the big iron door that Lucia stood before in a trance just a few months earlier. Even in the light of these stories that were real shocking and scary regarding the headless body, things like the police quote never helped to reassure the general public or the close families to people like Lucia and Elizabeth. It just created more widespread news that spread fear and concern. It was then Mr. Sean Manchester decided it was time to examine the catacomb he felt was the key. This mostly due to being disappointed to not have already brought these incidents to a close. Once again with assistance, it was Mr. Moore Manchester who lowered into the tomb. The setting inside was much the same it had been when he left a few months prior, except for one obvious change. When Mr. Manchester previously left the tomb back in March, there were 3 coffins within the tomb. However, now there was only 2. Mr. Sean Manchester got back in touch with Lucia that week and tried his best to encourage her to meet him outside the catacomb after one afternoon. Lucia was understandable, very nervous about the prospect, but eventually gave in to Mr. Manchester and agreed. Mr. Manchester brought a team of 3 assistants, who were all very equipped with all the necessary vampire repellent. When Lucia approached the catacombs that day, she could see the nervousness on her face on her arrival. Mr. Manchester's team did their best to put Lucia at ease. Once Lucia became calm enough, Mr. Manchester put his plan into action and placed Lucia in the way of the opposing door to the tomb and began to act upon his plan. Lucia gave her permissions to Mr. Sean Manchester, and with this agreement in place, Lucia was placed in a hypnotic trance. This process of Mr. Sean Manchester took some time for Lucia to be placed in a quiet state of mind, and this was not to do anything out of the ordinary. It was simply because of Lucia being that nervous and prevented the quick transaction. Lucia eventually reached the desired state, and Mr. Manchester began to ask questions to Lucia. It was a bit like we paranormal investors would call today known as the estimate method. Lucia responded to Mr. Sean Manchester questions, and initially was in Lucia's own voice, but then all of a sudden Lucia's voice started to go deeper, and suddenly the answers came to an end. In this deep, sinister voice, Lucia started to speak. She repeated the following: "You should not have come here. You should not have come here. You should not have come here. Lucia then became distraught for a few moments, possibly 10 minutes. Mr. Sean Manchester then stepped in and tried to calm Lucia down so we continued to probe for answers. However, Lucia's voice returned to normal and the calm returned. Mr. Manchester spoke to Lucia and asked her to try and remember and explain about the night she sleptwalked into the grounds of Highgate Cemetery. Instead of answering in one reply, she began to say, "Where are you? Where are you? Where are you?" It was as if Lucia was being summoned by someone with authority. After a moment, Lucia began to inquire within a trance. Each time Lucia asked with a surge, she got a little more upset and agitated. Mr. Manchester then noticed to his insistence not to intervene as Lucia got a little more restless. Eventually Lucia stood up and walked to a different door nearby and began sobbing in front of it, crying out loud. Lucia then became distraught for a few moments, possibly 10 minutes. Mr. Sean Manchester then stepped in and tried to add calm to Lucia so we can continue to probe for answers. However, Lucia's voice returned to normal and the calm returned. Mr. Sean Manchester spoke to Lucia and asked her to try and remember and explain about the night she sleepwalked into the grounds of the Highgate Cemetery. Instead of answering in one reply, she began to say, "Yes, I'm coming. Yes, I'm coming." It was as if Lucia was being summoned by someone with authority. After a moment, Lucia then began to inquire within her trance. Each time Lucia asked with a surge, she got a little more upset and agitated. Mr. Sean Manchester then mentioned to his assistants not to intervene as Lucia get a little more restless. Eventually Lucia stood up and walked to a complete different door nearby and began sobbing in front of it, crying out the following, "Where are you? Where are you? Where are you?" Mr. Manchester then, at this point, looked at his three associates. He knew at this point it was time to bring Lucia out of the trance she was currently in. Mr. Manchester then found himself suddenly playing with his own mind. What if this? Could it be? Wait, a new vault? Has this creature moved? Mr. Sean Manchester and his three assistants then had a brief discussion, and in no time at all the team of 4 had their soldiers pressed up against the door of the tomb, and they all found that this door did in fact open. At this time Mr. Sean Manchester felt a huge rush of excitement. At last he thought he was so close, but he had to contain with the mob of people that followed the cold winter weather and the darkness. Mr. Manchester now only wondered if the creature lay within a few yards of him, and if this is the time. All sorts went through Mr. Manchester's mind, such as, is it time? Should I? Daylight advantage? Inside the vault it was dark, and as the vault opened the team raised a foul, vile smell that went up all their nostrils. The vault was large and decayed. Coffins could be seen on shelves around the vault. It was lucky that this vault in particular listed as all its inhabitants and the names on the outside, and it only took a quick count to see that there was one more coffin in the vault than there should have been. In a quick look around the vault, they all came across a single coffin at the back of the vault that was in a visibly better condition than all the rest, and seemed to be positioned out of place. On a closer inspection by the team, this particular coffin brought no nameplate to identify who was laid within. The team took a big deep breath, and they all looked at each other with their hearts pounding. They surrounded the coffin For a moment the team were motionless, as if they couldn't believe what they were about to do next. Just a few seconds later, they all reached out and each one of the team took a hold of the coffin lid, and with all the strength they lifted and removed the lid. There it lay. Before them all lay a body that appeared neither alive nor dead, at least Mr. Sean Manchester's estimation. One of the team members broke the silence and asked, and half stated, "It's nearly dead." However, the team knew very well that this vault was well over 100 years old, and according to the inscription outside, there'd been no recent admissions. Mr. Sean Manchester knew what he needed to do, and what needed to happen, so Mr. Manchester placed a wooden stake above where he was supposed to preach a heart would be. But upon doing so, the same assistant who spoke first objected and this time grabbed Mr. Manchester's arm. To engage a district statement, such action at this time is not sanctionable. To this assistant, the body was not obviously of the undead in this moment, and the most unlikely humorous things happened in disagreement, and conversation as the appropriate cause of action broke out. Mr. Manchester debated back to the assistant, stating that this was the creature they had been seeking out, and that the stake was a traditional means of disposal. This was not an act of violence, but an act of healing, to allow evil to be defeated. Although the team did not disagree on what Mr. Sean Manchester said, it was the assistant that expressed Mr. Manchester that on this particular day, the proper mission to enter the vault and perform such a thing had not yet been attained. Allegedly that they had found the fanged creature that was causing havoc that night, and this came immediately after the season with Lucia, and despite Mr. Sean Manchester's obviously frustration, he related and agreed with his team. Mr. Sean Manchester then took the appropriate steps the next day to seek the necessary license and permissions from the cemetery. Despite this, the team also knew it was not just a case of closing the lid and hope it would be there when they returned. So the assistants reached out to Mr. Manchester and asked what alternative measures could now be employed. Mr. Sean Manchester then gave out a number of things that they could do to try and keep the creature where it was. So a crucifix was pointed on top of the coffin lid, and all four corners of the vault vessels of holy water were positioned. White lines of salt and bags of garlic were positioned. The doorway was lined with salt, and the four of them stood outside the door and prayed silently, asking for the strength and support to banish the creature once and for all. The team then looked at Mr. Sean Manchester and then at Lucia. The team formed a complete circle around Lucia, and Mr. Sean Manchester began with the spoken exorcism. White candles were around them to form a protective boundary, and Lucia was instructed to remain within the circle of light. Mr. Sean Manchester handed Lucia a Bible. Open to Cellar 54. Save me, O God, by thy name, and judge me by thy strength. Hear my prayer, O God. Give ear to the words of my mouth. For strangers are risen up against me, and apostles seek after my soul. They have not set God before them, Selah. Behold, God is mine helper. The Lord is with them that uphold my soul. He shall reward evil unto mine enemies. Cut them off in thy truth. I will freely sacrifice unto thee. I praise by thy name, O Lord, for it is good. For he hath delivered me out of all trouble, and mine eye hath seen the spire upon my enemies. Mr. Manchester went on to sprinkle holy water and recited prayers on the occasion, making a sign of the cross between each. They pleaded for strength and affection before Manchester continued with the following. Go forth, O deceiver, full of all evil and falsehood, the enemy of virtue, the persecutor against the innocent. Give peace, thou evil one, give peace, thou evil one, give place to Christ. As the last was before, the candles surrounding them all flickered, as if an unfelt draught swept past them. The light from the sun notably darkened, and as quick glance was all that was needed to see that the evening was drawing in. Mr. Manchester continued with the loud voice. Immediately, vibration booming sounds began to start suddenly. It was as loud as that Lucia dropped the Bible she was given from Mr. Manchester, and the group surrounded her had to stop Lucia from leaving the circle. Mr. Manchester cried out, "Begone the hideous demon up to thy unknown place, return no more, and don't take the children of Almighty God." He threw a large crucifix into the ground towards the inside of the vault. The crucifix landed, the vibration stopped. The team stood quietly in the circle. All was silent, all was scared to move. A peace seemed to fill the air all around them. Mr. Manchester asked for the vault to be bricked up, and it hit the point was hoped by all that this was to be the end. Or was it? Well, we can tell you, in a conclusion straight out of Harry Potter, Mr. David Farrant and Mr. Sean Manchester decided to hold a duel to decide once and for all which of the two men was a greater magician and paranormalist. Flyers started to appear around London Underground stations advertising the magic duel, which was scheduled for the 13th of April 1973 on Parliament Hill in Hampstead. Rumours swirled around in the media that the two were planning to sacrifice a cat in the presence of naked virgins. When a local man's beloved pet failed to return home one day, Mr. Farrant was villainized by the RSPCA and the media for allegedly having beheaded the animal as part of a pagan ritual. The duel never took place, and Mr. Farrant was arrested in 1974 next to Highgate Cemetery, carrying a crucifix and a wooden stake. Mr. Farrant was convicted of damaging memorials and interfering with dead remains, but he separately sued the News of the World for making him look like a cat killer, and because a lawsuit was much too wealthy for the likes of a magician, he also posted out on voodoo dolls and pins stuck to the heads to an RSPCA inspector and others who had called for his prosecution, just for good measure. With no duel to settle the matter, the feud between Mr. Manchester and Mr. Farrant is still alive and well, with Mr. Farrant involved in the distribution of a line of comics called The Adventures of Bishop Bonkers, with accompanying Bishop Bonkers merchandise. Mr. Manchester writes several blogs aimed at vilifying his rival, describing him from suffering from narcissistic personality disorders, and often illustrated with paintings of Farrant as a demon. He also claimed that he had later tracked the vampire down to a house in Crouch End, where he plunged a pike into his body and burnt it, thank goodness. Excitement around the cemetery died down, and now only history buffs are interested in visiting the graves. And if you're thinking that a Highgate vampire craze is like something out of the movie, that's because it is. Dracula 1972 was inspired by the bizarre events that took place there only 50 years ago. Well, that's it. That's our story for entertainment purposes only over the Highgate vampire. We do have extra video coming out in the next day, which is the vampire story of Highgate again, but by Mr. Sean Manchester himself. We'll release that in a couple of days. Well, hope you enjoyed, and